So if we're not lionizing Lincoln the way that we do, who do we look to, and what do they mean as a role model?
Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? At its most basic, a counterfactual is a what if. It's a way of understanding history as it is by discussing what it could have been. I'm Josh, a writer for the channel and son of the History Guy. Of course, you know the History Guy himself, Lance, and our friend Brad. We also are bringing on some guests to help liven up our discussions about what might have been. This is a series of podcasts that dwells on that eternal question. What if? On today's episode, we talk about a man whose influence on the trajectory of American history is undeniable and pervasive, but whose name you may never have heard of. John Hay, a secretary to President Lincoln and Secretary of State under Mckinley and Teddy Roosevelt. What might the world be like without him? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
The latter half of the 19th century was a dynamic time in world and U.S. politics, and for the United States, it marked that shift from always looking inward to starting to play a much more robust role on the international stage, and that would set the stage for the role that the U.S. played in the monumental events of the 20th century. And one person played an outsized role in the development of that new character. In his 50-year career of public service, he perhaps defined the national character more than any single U.S. president. And you've probably never heard his name. John Hay was Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary. He was a poet. He was a diplomat. He was the string that tied together the U.S. administrations from the Civil War to the 20th century. And he is quite possibly the most important person you never heard of. And his history deserves to be remembered. John Milton Hay was born in Salem, Indiana in 1838. When he was 3, his family moved to Warsaw, Illinois. In 1849, he went to live with his uncle Milton Hay in Pittsfield to attend a better school. Milton was a friend of fellow Illinoisian lawyer Abraham Lincoln and had done some of his law training at Lincoln's firm. Hay attended Brown University, where he became an excellent student and writer. When he graduated with a Master of Arts in 1858, he was named class poet. John returned to Illinois to clerk at his uncle's law firm in Springfield, located nearby Lincoln's own firm. The young John Hay was not interested in politics, but after Lincoln became the nominee, became an ardent supporter. Hay had years earlier first befriended the older John Nicolay, who worked as Lincoln's campaign secretary. When Nicolay found that he could not do all the work, he enlisted Hay, who worked full-time for the Lincoln campaign for 6 months. When Lincoln was elected, Nicolay encouraged him to retain Hay's services, and both of them followed Lincoln to Washington as his secretaries. They shared a single bedroom in the White House. Lincoln worked long hours, sometimes 14-hour days, and so did his secretaries. They combined the role of chief of staff, press secretary, and gatekeeper to the president. Office seekers swarmed the White House, so much so that Hay once remarked, "The number of people in the United States who find it impossible to earn an honest living must be appalling." Nicolay was known for his ill-temper and called the bulldog in the White House, but Hay was friendly, a great conversationalist, and often smiling. One observer described Hay as a nice young fellow who unfortunately looks about 17 and is oppressed by the necessity of behaving like 70. He became a close friend of Lincoln's 17-year-old son, Robert. One historian described Hay as Lincoln's propagandist, and he often wrote anonymous articles that supported the administration's views or spun bad news. After the Union loss in the Battle of First Manassas in July 1861, Hay was in Washington to watch crowds of soldiers, some without anything but their soiled and dirty uniforms, retreat to Washington. But in the papers he said it was only a victory of vastly superior numbers over a few sedentary regiments, and that there is nothing in this but the lives lost and the lives which must be lost to make it good. Willie Lincoln died in early 1862, and Abraham's grief was enormous. He found some solace in his young secretary, Hay, thinking of him, if not a surrogate son, then a young man who stirred a higher form of parental nurturing in the president. Contemporaries agreed, with one saying that Lincoln loved him as a son. Lincoln was close with his secretaries, and he spent every minute with one or both. He visited them and told stories when he was up at night, and what little levity could enter the White House often came from Hay, telling jokes, and Lincoln's booming laugh. Hay and Nicolay were with Lincoln when he gave the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln sent Hay all over the country during the war on missions for himself and the military, and by the end of the war he was a brevet colonel. Once Lincoln was safely reelected and the war seemed likely to end soon, Hay and Nicolay petitioned the president for new jobs. Nicolay wished to marry, and Hay to find new experiences. Mary Lincoln also sought their ouster, as they often bumped heads. The secretaries called her the Hellcat. Lincoln appointed them both to the U.S. delegation to France. Hay was at the White House with Robert when Abraham and Mary went to Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. They hurried to his side after he was shot and remained there all night until he died. Hay said that a look of unspeakable peace came across his worn features at the moment of death. Hay took the loss very hard. In an 1866 letter, he said that Lincoln was the greatest character since Christ. He would spend much of the rest of his life mourning the man who had put him on a course for the rest of his life. For a few years, Hay served in diplomatic teams in Europe, in France and Vienna, with light workloads that allowed him to travel. In 1871, he served in Spain under President Grant. He also began working with Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, then the largest circulating paper in the country. Ralph Waldo Emerson joked that Greeley did all his readers' thinking in theory for them, for $2 a year. Hay began by writing editorials, and Greeley's term pronounced him the best he'd ever hired. He reported on the Great Chicago Fire and interviewed Mrs. O'Leary, whose cow supposedly caked the lamp that spilled the kerosene that fired the straw that burned Chicago. Simultaneously, he was gaining fame as a poet. He was published 11 times in 1871. He became famous as a literary realist, writing down-to-earth poetry when he mimicked the peculiar dialect of his childhood home of Pike County, Illinois. One of his most popular was called Jim Bludso, about a steamboat engineer with 2 wives who weren't no saint, but who sacrificed his life fighting fire in the boiler room to save the lives of the boat's passengers. He weren't no saint, but at judgment I'd run my chance with Jim, alongside of some pious gentleman that wouldn't have shook hands with him. He seen his duty, a dead sure thing, and he went for it there and then. And Christ ain't a-gonna be too hard on a man that died for men. Though he was known as an immense favorite of the ladies, Hay remained a bachelor until he met Clara Stone in 1872, the daughter of a wealthy railroad magnate from Ohio. It was love at first sight. I have been struck down, Hay wrote. There is only one, and one is enough. Her father, Amasa Stone, had begun as a railroad engineer and amassed a fortune, eventually becoming a board member of Western Union and Standard Oil. Hay proposed to her in 1873, and they married in February of 1874. Thanks to Amasa, Hay became a rich man running his father-in-law's investments, which were so safe they require no care. Amasa built a lavish home, and Hay was soon worth $3 million, over $60 million in 2020 dollars. The couple had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The girls remembered him as a tender-hearted father who spoiled them shamefully. When Amasa committed suicide following a train accident was blamed on his company, Hay became even wealthier. Helping to run the companies helped to make Hay anti-labor, and Amasa was in Europe, where Hay dealt with the Great Strike of 1877. He was frustrated at the lower classes and wrote that the country is at the mercy of the mob. He wrote his only novel in response, The Breadwinners, in which he lambasted organized labor. Perhaps wisely, he chose to publish it anonymously. He re-entered politics in 1879 when President Hayes appointed him Assistant Secretary of State. He supported James Garfield in the election of 1880 and advised the president and friend on appointments upon election, but did not join the administration. He grieved for a second president when Garfield was shot and died in 1881. His family spent several months of every year in Europe and built 2 new homes, an enormous mansion in Washington and a more modest cottage in New Hampshire that he called the Fells. In Washington, they joined historian Henry Adams, grandson of President John Quincy Adams, Adams' wife Clover, and famed geologist Clarence King to form a tight-knit club they called the 5 of Hearts. Unfortunately, Clover committed suicide in 1885. It was during this time that he and John Nicolay began writing the 10-volume Abraham Lincoln, A History, using papers Robert Lincoln held. Their primary goal was to reveal the real Lincoln, as former acquaintances like Lincoln's law partner William Herndon were making a living selling their own versions, and Lincoln's reputation still hung in the balance. The 2 secretaries wrote more than 1.2 million words about the former president and his time over the next 15 years. It began publishing in 1890, at first a chapter at a time in serial form in Century magazine, but eventually as a 10-volume work. They were accused of aggressive northernism, but it came at a time when Southern apologists were engaging in what Hay and Nicolay believed to be revisionist history. The work would become the basis of the image of Lincoln we know today, the great orator, the sage father figure, and the master of a team of rivals. Hay was an early supporter of William McKinley, first Speaker of the House in 1889 and then his nominee for president in 1896. Hay had been among the first to send money when McKinley was nearly bankrupted in the 1893 panic, and Hay helped to run the nomination campaign as early as 1894. He admired McKinley, who he called awfully like Lincoln in many respects. Hay donated so much to McKinley's campaign that Henry Adams later wondered, I would give sixpence to know how much Hay paid for Mckinley. His politics must have cost. For his services, Mckinley appointed Hay minister to England. He was well liked in the capital, and Queen Victoria called him the most interesting of all ambassadors I have known. When John Sherman left his position as Secretary of State, Mckinley happily invited Hay to take his place. The U.S. had just won the Spanish-American War, quickly and easily, and what was left was to dismantle Spain's empire. As Secretary, Hay completed treaties that gave U.S. control over the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. He also came to an agreement with England and Germany to secure American Samoa. He also supported a China free of colonialism and submitted the Open Door Note in September 1899, which demanded unhindered trade for all in the Pacific nation. The open door policy protected trade, but also Chinese sovereignty, looking for a middle path that kept China from being controlled by any single European power. The Chinese weren't accommodating. Anti-foreign sentiment was rife, especially with the Fists of Righteous Harmony, or the Boxers. The Boxer Rebellion grew quickly, and soon missionaries had been killed and the foreign legations besieged. When the multinational relief force was sent, Hay feared that Europe had decided to conquer the country. He worked with the Chinese minister in Washington to help establish a resolution to the conflict in which China lost no territory to Europe. Theodore Roosevelt replaced McKinley's dead vice president for the 1900 election, which they won handily. But the new century would bring tragedy for John Hay. First, in 1901, his oldest son Albert accidentally fell from a sixth-floor window in Connecticut and died. It hit Hay hard, who collapsed when he reached New Haven, simply overwhelmed. Hay was at the Fells in September when he learned that McKinley had been shot at
The Pan American Exposition.
Doctors thought they had saved the president with surgery, so Hay went to Washington to manage the government. McKinley's condition quickly became grave. In the early hours of September 14th, Hay was alone in Washington, weeping while he awaited the inevitable news. It was Hay who telegrammed the news of the president's death to Vice President Roosevelt, who was traveling in the dead of night out of the Adirondacks. Hay visited John Nicolay on his deathbed only a few days later, and left that meeting stricken with grief. In December, Clarence King died, leaving only 3 in the 5 of Hearts. "What a strange and tragic fate it has been of mine," he said, "to stand by the bier of 3 of my dearest friends, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. 3 of the gentlest of men, all risen to be head of state, and all done to death by assassins." Roosevelt insisted that McKinley's cabinet stay on, especially the venerated Hay, and so he did. He negotiated a treaty that would end disagreements over Alaska's southernmost borders, and worked on finally securing American rights to what became the Panama Canal. For years, the preferred right had been through Nicaragua, but Roosevelt set his eyes instead on Panama, then part of Colombia. First negotiations with the British failed, and then when Hay negotiated with Colombia, the foreign Congress rejected it. Hay and Roosevelt decided that they had played nice long enough. Hay predicted an insurrection on the Isthmus of Panama against the regime of folly and graft of Bogota, a prediction that came true with the help of Panamanian agent in Washington and the ominous presence of U.S. ships off the Panamanian coast. America had its canal. Hay never overcame his grief for the loss of his son. 3 years after his death, he wrote, "The death of our boy made my wife and me old at once and for the rest of our lives." Roosevelt insisted Hay stay on for a second term, but the ailing Hay went to Europe on leave, hoping to restore his health. He went with his wife and Henry Adams and visited medicinal baths. A little of his humor remained, as he wrote to a friend that "there is nothing the matter with me except old age, the Senate, and 1 or 2 other mortal maladies." He visited Washington once more in June before leaving for the Fells, where he died on July 1st. John Hay would be considered to be important. He would deserve to be remembered merely for the role that he played in the historical understanding of the humanity of Abraham Lincoln. One historian said that Americans today understand Lincoln in much the way that Nicolay and Hay hoped that they would. But it's difficult to overstate the role that he played in U.S. foreign policy. His actions weren't always without controversy, but he brought about more than 50 treaties in one of the most important times in U.S. diplomatic history. He played an outsized role in the development of U.S. policy towards Asia and in the redevelopment of our special relationship with the United Kingdom. And those would be defining factors in the role that the U.S. would play in the defining events of the 20th century. And yet his name is nearly forgotten. He once said that when he died, "I shall not be much missed, except for by my wife." He died at just the age of 66, and yet he had outlived so many of his friends. And in his 50-year career in public service, he impacted both presidents and policy. With the great personalities of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, John Hay was an arrow that ran through both.
Now for the fun part. where we discuss what might have happened if it all went a little differently. So today we really get to talk about someone who's really very remarkable, and he had a remarkable career from Lincoln to Roosevelt, which are two of the most iconic American presidents. And he ended up playing a role somewhat in the background. I think very few people could name John Hay, and fewer could name what it is he did. He ended up playing incredibly important roles in diplomacy. He also played, of course, an important role in Lincoln's life and in several other people's lives. He talked about the three presidents. He was three different presidents who were assassinated. So we are really looking at someone who ultimately had an unsung role in really influencing how the 20th century played out, especially American policy. And he was at a pivotal moment that really changed the trajectory of America,
the United States. Yeah.
And how the United States was going to work into the 20th century was not a given, and it had a lot to do with decisions that he made.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have to look very far when you talk to John Hay, when you ask questions about things like what if the U.S. had not fought the First World War or the Spanish-American War or had not annexed Hawaii. There's things in there that are just the impact that they have on the world is profound. And for good or for ill. I mean, the thing is, there are certainly criticisms of John Hay. He was kind of the man that turned the United States into an imperialist state. Is that good? Is that a bad thing? Argue various ways to say that, but in the end, it is history. History is history, and those are important, monumental historical events, and that role especially into the major events of the 20th century. But the U.S. is such a different nation at the end of the 19th century than we were at the beginning of the 19th century. Such a different nation at the end of the 19th century than we were during the Civil War, and that alteration, that change in who we were as a people, as a country, as a political entity, and on the world stage, so much of that ties back to John Hay that is kind of startling that his name is not better known.
Yeah, I do I really like this topic because I think that this is kind of a capstone episode in a way, because we get to refer back to some of our previous discussions on Samoa and the Russo-Japanese War. Of which John Hay played a pivotal role in each.
So we also, I think we did one on USS Boston, which was the same period. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff we've talked about the events, but yeah, so many of them track back to this that it really does. You find out the reason maybe why there was a theme in those is because there was someone actually kind of in the background. He didn't necessarily control these events. I mean, he impacted them, but I'm not sure everything went the way that he would have preferred it. But certainly he set a lot of policy forward. And I mean, there's a lot of questions that you could start off with. What if the U.S. had not built the Panama Canal? What if it had been built by somebody else? Or had built somewhere else? Because there were all sorts of other discussions. That means a lot of things. One of them being that Panama might not be an independent nation now. It might still be part of Nicaragua, right? The
existence of Panama, which, to be fair, there's some criticisms you could make on that. I mean,
is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I don't know.
The extent of the native movement toward independence in Panama, without the action of the United States, it's unclear that Panama would have become a nation. I mean, I think that's certainly not when it did, but this was how this canal was going to be built. Without that, it wasn't going to happen. The deal with Colombia was not going to work out. Neither side apparently were willing to make that happen. Even before that, the treaty that he negotiates with the British, so that the United States is the one that gets exclusive control over the zone that they were going to build there. I mean, this is how the Panama Canal exists and what it meant to the United States specifically, but also what it meant to the world. It was a lot to Hay.
Absolutely. Even delaying the Panama Canal certainly impacts U.S. manifest destiny and how quickly we fill in the middle of the nation, because that Panama Canal allows us to be bicoastal in a way that we couldn't be before. And so, I mean, how much do we populate Wyoming really does partly depend upon John Hay saying that we had a way across to California more quickly from the East Coast to the West Coast. So it's significant. I mean, in terms of today, if the U.S. One of the arguments that we've had is that China was seeking some control in the Panama Canal zone, and we understood that was a massive security risk. So much of our national security today depends upon our ability to move our Navy quickly through even our supercarriers can go through the Panama Canal. That's so that we're still today saying we know that if we didn't control the canal, or that we didn't have access to the canal, or if one of our enemies could control the canal, we know that that would dramatically impact our security. Well, that tells you how different the whole century would have been than since the canal. And
Mm.
that's one of the things to say. We very likely could not have negotiated the treaty that allowed us to build the canal, regardless of all the all the people involved in the impossible task of building the canal. Regardless of that, we probably couldn't have gotten a shovel in the ground were it not for the diplomacy of John Hay. That's a massive
Yeah.
change.
Mm. And up until this point in history, the 19th century really is dominated by the concept of the Monroe Doctrine.
Hmm.
So, to be able to support the Monroe Doctrine, obviously, you can't have major powers flaunting the ability of America to,
Hmm.
to have its, if you want to call it a sphere of influence, hey, that's what it is. And we define that. And we were able to keep that in play. Now, um, the French building the Panama Canal, I'm not suggesting that, the French would have immediately gone to war with the United States and annexed back the Louisiana Territory. But certainly it would have been a more of a balancing act.
To
And
me
at
as well.
various times, depending on how the relations between France and the United States were proceeding, there could have been situations where during a particular crisis or a particular event, France might have said, "Well, America, we're not going to allow your ships through,"
Uh-huh.
and that would have been that would have been the quote nuclear option.
Well, I mean,
Um,
so it certainly could have impacted us economically. We might not have grown to the economic powerhouse that we are. But I mean, that also might mean that the French developed the larger empire in the Pacific. I mean, they tried, and I mean, there were certainly French territories there. But if France had controlled the Panama Canal, maybe when it comes along to Japan saying that they want to dominate the Pacific, the people that they are competing with is not the United States, but the French. And
French
that's a
had
very
other
different
stuff going on.
that sets up a very different sort of scenario, and if France is getting a massive empire, if they're developing economically differently, then perhaps I mean France is a major world power in the First and Second World War, but what if they're even more? And might that impact all the alliances that have impacted the First World War, right? Might it been a Franco-Prussian alliance rather than a Franco-British alliance, or a British-Prussian alliance rather than a French-British alliance? I mean, all that could certainly differ if France controlled the Panama Canal Zone, or if England can control the Panama Canal Zone, or if Germany controlled the Panama Canal Zone, or if Japan controlled the Japanese control the Panama Canal Zone. All of those end up making very different worlds, which changes all of the alliances, which define all the big events of the 20th century. And many of those take the U.S. out. This will get me in trouble, but I mean, really, without John Hay, do we wind up just being, Canada? Good
It's
at hockey.
you know
I don't mean to be rude. Canada's it's a beautiful place. It really is. But I mean, Canada is not the same sort of player on the world stage that the United States is.
in
And
terms
what
of
if we
how
had the
that
same sort of
happened.
attitude? I mean, they might be friendlier to us when we go visit. I mean, because if you're in Europe and people don't like you, just pretend you're from Canada. That's what they always say you're from Canada. But I mean, what if we were more of a friendly, happy poutine eating place rather than the forceful nation that we are in world affairs? There's a lot of people that say that would be fantastic, but then you have to think about what are the consequences if you don't have the
what are the
United States in the world
ramifications?
that we're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, those could be certainly massive as well. So it's not hard to say
Mm.
without the Panama Canal, maybe we stay out of both world wars. And it's not hard to say
Okay.
if the U.S. stays out of both world wars that they may be in differently.
Mhm. This, I think, relates back, and this touches on another aspect of the career of John Hayes, and that is the 5 years that he spent at the New York Tribune. Very much, he was definitely at least somewhat sympathetic to the anti-imperialist movement. Um, he did not necessarily go lockstep with Teddy Roosevelt into walk softly and carry a big stick. And if you look at the man and his accomplishments and the way that he lived his life, you can kind of understand this. He is relatively conservative. He likes preparation. He is very much a person who's a consensus builder, um, which ironically, or not, actually unironically, makes him the perfect man for the diplomatic positions at which he excelled.
Which
He,
is an interesting, because if you see him as the imperialist, and then you argue maybe without Hay we don't fight the banana wars, maybe without Hay we're not the nation that caused the harms that people claim that the nation has caused. I mean, they're part of history. Maybe he was actually mitigating our imperialist instincts.
yeah,
Maybe without a John Hay we would have been more aggressive, and that could have meant quite a lot. I mean, it could have meant other wars or conflicts with other imperial powers, or wars at different times. And so you could try to say without Hay, we don't say fight the Spanish-American War, or you could try to say that without Hay, maybe we fight it much earlier or much more aggressively, or we actually annex Cuba,
yeah.
or do some other things, on the imperialist stage that we didn't do. So I mean, it's an interesting question. Again, history is history, and he was there. And he played a role in both of us becoming an imperialist nation, but also in how that imperialism would manifest.
Yeah, Roosevelt
Mhm.
was known for being a bit impetuous. He
Hmm.
was highly energetic. One of the amazing things about him is people will say it was exhausting to be around him. That
Hmm.
he just had such incredible energy, and Hay was not that way. As Brad was saying, Hay is slow. He is much more cautious about the way he does things, and so in a lot of ways, Hay and Roosevelt aligned. But you can see Roosevelt had differing opinions on Hay, because at one point he essentially says, "Oh, he was the perfect Secretary of State," and then there was another time where he says something along the lines of, "He was a fine figurehead," but Roosevelt essentially saying, I deserve credit for what he for what people are saying Hay did," and that's very Roosevelt. And to be fair, he was president, and Hay was working for him in those periods. But to say that Hayes, that he was a figurehead, I think is probably unfair.
It's probably unfair, well, especially given the history that Hay had. But honestly, if someone was moderating Roosevelt, then that could be significant. That could be
Yeah,
very significant about how the U.S. started acting.
Yeah,
If we were acting on his, energetic impulses, they might have at points been too energetic, which you can certainly be.
yeah. To refer back to a comment you were making earlier regarding Canada, without John Hay, the U.S. and Canada, and potentially Great Britain as the major partner of Canada, may have gone to war over territorial
Abs-
disputes.
yeah,
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, more than anyone, he was responsible for the rapprochement of the last part of the 19th century, which turned into the special relationship, which is just, strained here and there, but I mean, it would certainly define the 20th century. So, had he not uh, managed that rapprochement,
yeah,
there was when the Washington Naval Treaty was passed, it was not so much in anticipation of war with Japan; it was trying to prevent war with Great Britain.
yeah. Well,
And
and
so, yeah, I mean, you can easily say that were it not for John Hay, is there a chance that somewhere at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, that the United States and Great Britain would have gone to war? And what would that have meant? Because obviously, then the First and Second World War would be very different if the U.S. and Great Britain had beaten the tar out of each other, shortly before, or if they weren't so likely to protect each other. I mean, in a simple sense, if the U.S. wasn't here as the arsenal of democracy, probably the Allies lose the Second World War. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of hard to argue otherwise. It's even hard to argue from the position that Russia was the one that won the war. They could not have done that without U.S. support. They probably would have been knocked out of the war much earlier without U.S. support. So, if you simply if you simply took the U.S. out of the picture, I mean, obviously those wars are very different. But if you took the U.S. and Britain out of the picture, or made the U.S. and Britain antagonists at the time, golly, what isn't different today?
Hmm. Yeah, and just to follow up on that, in 1917, both British and the French were scraping the bottom of the barrel. And, not too long after the United States finally got into the war and finally committed to sending troops and actually had begun to send troops over, the French mutiny. I mean, yes, Germans marched down the Champs-Élysées.
Hmm.
uh, it's the Franco-Prussian War all over again. The indemnity is put on the Allies, and Germany becomes an ascendant Central European power that is unassailable, throughout the 20th century.
Yeah,
So,
certainly. Yeah, if it's not for Hay in a number of ways, if it's not for
Yeah.
Hay for moving the U.S. to play on the international scene, if it's not for Hay's negotiation that gives us the Panama Canal, if it's not for Hay developing the special relationship, a lot of those sorts of things means a very good chance that it's Germany that ends up dominating Europe and dominating the world stage, and that's a fascinating thought to see what it was. And of course, that's very different if that happens in 1918 than if it happens in 1938, right?
oh, yeah.
Probably very different for the people of Europe if it happens in 1918 than if it happens in
Mhm.
1938.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine a mid-century war between the Soviet Union and a very large German state? The scope of the war, in my opinion, would have been even greater. The death, destruction, just the absolute terror of the war would have reached places that I don't think that it went to in World War II, which, I do not want to minimize that
Hard to
World War
imagine
II
being
was
worse,
not.
more horrible than World War II. Though, I mean, also the Pacific War is a whole different idea. And I mean, do Japan and Germany even care about each other? If in the or is the Pacific War really literally just a different war? I
Yeah.
mean, if
Mm,
without the U.S. And the conflict between U.S. and Japan, then the Second World War is different just from that all along. But I mean, imagine if we are sitting out a war between a Europe-dominated Germany and the Bolsheviks. Uh, that's huge. I mean, that's
mhm.
that is a very different
Well,
idea of how the world develops.
mhm. Yeah, and the fallout from that, the British are stripped of their empire, or at the very least, parts of their empire. Um, the German presence at Tsingtao ends up potentially carving out a section of a portion of the Soviet Union at the time, or perhaps they declare a free German state in a sizable portion of Manchuria. Um, you might very well have had a World War I dust up between the Germans and the Japanese as they were fighting for dominance,
Yeah.
with the power vacuum left from the defeated French and British, and suddenly
And the
China
United
is
States had
ripe for the picking.
never built a Pacific Empire. I mean, if we don't build a Pacific Empire,
Yes.
then that means something. Or, on the other hand, and this is one that's really kind of hard to imagine, but I mean, if we don't go to war in the Spanish-American War, if we never decide to intervene, which without Hay moving us to the world stage, we may well not. I mean, there was a lot of movement in the United States not to get involved in that war. If we don't, if Spain retains its empire, and it's kind of hard to imagine because Spain had so declined by the time they reached in the 20th century, and then of course they essentially in the Spanish Civil War had kind of taken themselves out as a power in the world wars. But I mean, what if Spain retains its empire? What if they're the major nation that is dominating Europe still? And what happens if Spain still holds the Philippines? Then is there a chance that the conflict is between a much larger, more powerful Spain and
Yeah.
Japan?
Or
So I mean, you could see how it could have been a conflict between Britain and Japan, a conflict between France and Japan, a conflict between Spain and Japan, a conflict between Germany and Japan. Japan's at
Mhm.
least hanging out where they belong, right? They're in the
yeah.
Pacific there. But which European powers in the way and wants to challenge them for dominance? That a lot of that has to do with John Hayes. The reason that the one they were challenging was the United States, and if we didn't, who else would, and how different would the world be?
How the Spanish American
Mhm.
War went had a lot to do with John Hay.
Hmm.
Because one of the reasons, I mean, England essentially decides to be on the United States side and not directly, but they offer essentially tacit support there where they don't try to get in the way. There were a lot of people in Europe who saw the United States, smacking around monarchy, that they saw that as extremely bad. And there were places like Austria and Prussia who probably would have rather the United States not do that and either have gotten involved to try to preserve Spain's empire, or I mean, Germany liked the idea of coming in and stealing
Still in
pieces
the
of
Philippines.
Spain's.
Yeah.
Literally in the Philippines, the German ships were there,
Hmm.
and British ships had stood literally positioned their boats between American and German ones at one point in the harbor at Manila. And so we were literally talking a point where there could have been a shooting war between against Germany in the
Yeah.
Philippines. It wasn't super likely. I don't think Germany really was interested in that war, but Germany was hoping to pressure people. And if you had, say, England actively pressuring the United States as well as everybody else in Europe, you might get a different ending to how
I
to
remember we
the
were on the
United
opposite sides
States.
with the Germans in the Samoan crisis
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
So I mean, Germany very much wanted to have a powerful empire in the Pacific, and there's different ways where what John Hay did could have meant
yeah.
that was possible.
Yeah, that
I mean,
relationship with
through a
England
number of
had a lot
different
to do
things
with
that he did.
him.
Our relationship with England, our the fact that we decided to be a world power, the fact that we built the Panama Canal, all of those could certainly impact whether the U.S. is playing in the Pacific. And if not, or if so, I mean, it could mean that we could have been fighting Germany for dominance in the Pacific, and that's a very different scenario.
Yeah, especially if, as part of the Great War, Germany is able to fight Japan to a standstill and hold on to her colonial possessions, potentially, again, even the German naval bases and harbors and infrastructure that they were developing in their quote sphere of influence in their section of occupied China. Kind of as an aside, you know, there is a lot of historical self-flagellation, I think, when it comes to issues of imperialism.
Hmm.
If we imagine a timeline in which the United States becomes incredibly isolationist,
Hmm.
the question is, who would have carved up China?
Hmm.
Because would there have been a moderating influence? Hay's open door policy, I think, is underestimated in its
Hmm.
importance. Um, it is more than just a statement. It is more than just a suggestion that the big boys play nice on the playground. Um, it really kind of gives a little bit of a codification to, okay, maybe this should be the attitude that we take towards one another. And the wholesale carving up of China, which was not off the table before the
Hmm.
United States said, "Hey, let's come up with some rules and let's all agree that we're not going to, take Chinese territory and turn this into, basically the Middle East or Africa." So, yeah, open door policy incredibly important, and
Hmm.
it does have an effect. It unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it is an historical fact that there was at least a framework that was put in place, and I
Hmm.
think that John Hay honestly felt, and I think the United States benefited from the fact that it was the United States coming and saying, "Hey guys, you know what you did in Africa and the Middle East and South America? Don't do that here."
Yeah,
It did
we can't
not
do that
end
in China.
well.
They talk
Yeah,
about
actually, the open door policy is really interesting. A lot of people would complain that the open door policy essentially ended up, giving European entry into China, and that would lead to a lot of what happened in the 20th century. But on the other hand, it really was mitigating how they did that, and ensured that the Europeans didn't just take territory away after the Boxer Rebellion. And so
Russia
that's
did.
another one. Yeah, yeah,
Russia did anyway, right? Russia didn't give up Manchuria,
Oh yeah.
and
that's true. Yeah, fair point. Yeah.
Russia was ready to invade, and they would have taken more if they'd had the opportunity to, and it could have turned into a European war over who's going to be able to take what parts of China,
Yeah, absolutely.
and then the
Yeah.
U.S. almost certainly would have
Yeah.
wanted to get involved because we don't want to be left out.
Yeah. The end of the Second Japanese Sino-Japanese War.
Yeah,
Um, Russia just comes and says, "Yeah, we're taking the entire peninsula and Port Arthur." The Japanese are like, "Well, we conquered it, so we should get it." And the open door policy, at least, is someone standing up in the middle of a bar brawl saying, "No, don't
yeah,
do this. This is not the right action to take." I do love, apparently, at the Portsmouth conference even though John Hay at this point is sick. It's obvious he's dying. He's not playing a major role. But apparently, at one point, he sent a letter to the various delegations and said, "Okay, guys, who's for carving up the territories in what way?" And because he asked for the public commitment, no one wanted to step forward and say, "Oh yeah, we definitely want a huge slice of this." So the Portsmouth Conference, again, there was territory exchange. China was carved up in ways that it should not have been. Um, the fact that territory was taken away from Japan certainly is going to be casus belli later on, a little later on in the 20th century. But John Hay, again, he's playing a role there, and he's doing it quietly, just by sending out some letters. And again, forcing that, first person who steps over that line is going to be the bad guy, and no one's willing to step over that line.
Well,
so
he knew when to be gutsy like that. I mean, the open door policy, he sends, that circular around essentially. And when no one responds, he's just like, guess you accepted it. And that made it fact. No one was willing to be the one that didn't accept it. And I mean, literally, there was no agreement. There was nothing, there was no discussion about it. He sent it out and then said, guess you agreed. It's incredible that he was able to make those movements when he did. And I mean, he even did it, before he was Secretary of State, before he was ambassador to England under Mckinley. He was in London in 1895 when Grover Cleveland was making a stand in Venezuela over this border crisis between Venezuela and Britain. And he is part of the reason, especially when, as McKinley gets elected, that this talk between England and the United States didn't turn into war, and that we decide instead for this. It was surprising at the time that turned into a diplomatic solution rather than a military one. And he wasn't the person. He was literally didn't have an official position, but he was there to be able to say McKinley is not going to change that policy, among other things, and had relationships with the people in England who were making some of those decisions. And so this, I mean, even before he was in, actually ambassador to England, he was able to be driving this rapprochement that literally meant in 1895, we were shocked that we didn't go shoot at British people.
And we didn't have a shooting war.
And 20 years later, we're ready to fight on their side. And that shift, the 19th century was not friendly with England. I mean, there were numerous fights. I mean, in Canada, there's the Aroostook War. I mean, there's all this stuff where we fought and were willing to fight, and that changed remarkably quickly. But I also there was a book I was looking at. It is called An Uncertain Tradition: American Secretaries of State in the 20th Century by Norman Grabner, I think. And he's when he starts talking about how secretaries of state changed, how it became a really truly vital international role, Hay is who he starts with. Hay is the first chapter of that book. And how important Hay was to really changing how the United States, dealt with international issues as Secretary of State, despite really not serving that long a period, between McKinley and Roosevelt, and then, I mean, dying essentially in that position.
Yeah, I think that relates very much to if John Hay is not the ambassador to Great Britain for the 2 years that he was.
Yeah.
Does that end up going to Dan Sickles? And what type of British American relations are you going to get out of that?
It was a vital moment for Hay to be involved there.
Absolutely, yeah. That's an interesting question, and it's really kind of hard to drive. Who knows what? I mean, Sickles was an interesting guy, but who knows what his policy would have been at that point? And the point that Josh just made, it remade the Department of State into being the department that it is, today. And it's, if the U.S. had not been the diplomatic force that it was going into the 20th century, goodness, right? I mean, we definitely tried to remake the world after the First World War. We tried to remake the world after the Second World War. In many ways that we do remake the world after the Second World War. What if we never developed that whole idea? I mean, prior in the 19th century, when the ambassador was just whoever had a business interest there, they weren't even paid.
Yeah.
To transform the Secretary of State to an actual cabinet player that really does control U.S. foreign policy, that's a massive impact on the U.S. certainly over time.
So, yeah, back to the New York Tribune. John Hay has a moment in which he may have fallen from grace. What if he gets behind the Horace Greeley liberal Republican nomination, throws his weight, some of his financial resources behind it, and adds some intellectual gravitas? Does this result in in an anti-imperialist, more moderate Republican administration? I kind of think that that's probably not the case. I don't think that Horace Greeley really was ever going to get a campaign off the ground in such a way that it would seriously challenge the establishment Republicans. But it is an interesting thought. What if America goes into that isolationist stage before World War One, and it's possible we never enter the war. It's possible we have no role whatsoever in the Sino-Japanese War or in the Russo-Japanese War.
Well, Greeley in particular, because Greeley, if he'd been elected in 1872, he died before he would have taken office. He died before the Electoral College.
That would have
right? Would have been a constitutional crisis. We had no definition of what to do if someone had won the popular vote, had won the Electoral College, and died before the Electoral College met.
And
so it would be interesting if Hay, because he was working. That's a scenario I had not considered when we started looking at that. This, could Hay have caused constitutional crisis because he got Greeley elected, and then Greeley, croaks?
What would that mean? Like, I don't know. Was there a possibility?
Who would have been president? What we would have done with the constitutional crisis?
Would it have been totally destabilizing?
I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the point where Sasquatchia rises up and takes control of the White House. I was trying to figure out how to figure Sasquatches into this one, but at the point that you have a constitutional crisis and don't know who the president is, maybe that's their end. That's the Bigfoot end to controlling the U.S. government.
They would bring stability.
They would bring stability.
Yeah, just to bring it back for a moment from the part of the episode that I typically look forward to the most is that yet again we are referring to a previous podcast that we have done on the election of 1876, where again Horace Greeley's presidential run obviously is only 4 years before that. This is at a time when the Grant administration has not been. It's obvious there's corruption, but at that point, Grant himself is, viewed as being above it. Again, John Hay, a player during a critical period in American history, that harkens back to one of our previous episodes. So everyone, go back and listen to those episodes.
Yeah, it's interesting how this kind of is an umbrella over so many of these important moments.
Yeah, Brad was talking about that being a capstone, is that he touches so many pieces of this latter part of the 19th century, which we've talked a lot about, a lot of stuff. That he's actually kind of, you get down beneath it, and he's kind of an underlying hand behind all that.
Yeah.
Another piece of John Hay's history that people do not understand very well, and part of it is because I think that John Hay at the time wanted to remain kind of behind the curtain on this one. But when he writes The Breadwinners, he is publicly stating that organized labor is something that should be avoided at all cost, and that instead we should fall back on a more traditional America, where jobs are created by business and men are free to sell their labor to the highest bidder wherever they can, and businesses are motivated by profits. And the entire concept of organized labor is an artificial construct that displaces or that unbalances that fine balance between those two factors.
Well, so the opposite side, did the Breadwinners shift the nation in its thinking on organized labor in order to mitigate the excesses of organized labor in the period?
It's also
because
if he did,
he opposed organized labor. So I mean, if he hadn't been there to oppose it,
yeah,
how different would things have been?
he
And it's kind of hard to say how much the breadwinners impacted national consciousness at the time.
if he had
But I
attached
mean,
his
there were.
name to it, I mean, it was it was controversial, and that
Mhm.
might have made it so that he never held, his official positions just because they didn't want to. I mean, that's a possibility. Is that would have the fact that he didn't attach his name to it might have actually saved his political career, but
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's another
Yeah. Now,
reason why
was it a
people might not think of him as a hero. And
yeah,
I don't know that we want to present him as a hero. I think we can say, I mean, you can see him, in positive light, a negative light, or as a complex guy, but certainly you can say that he was enormously impactful.
I think that he very much believed in the concept of a gentleman American who was well versed in poetry, philosophy, who
Mhm.
dabbled in various things. Very much a product of of his financial background, and he obviously is very, very well connected in Washington D.C.
Mhm.
Even though, interestingly enough, not quite enough to pull a plum position uh, in the diplomatic corps up
yeah.
until the McKinley administration.
Mhm.
He refused. He was offered something in Garfield's administration, and he didn't think it was good enough, right? That was, and so he didn't take it. Which, well, attaching yourself to Garfield's presidency might not have been great since it wasn't a very long
It was a very
presidency.
long
But
presidency.
it's true that he was not, despite really running in those circles for such a long time. He was more of an artist. He was known more for his writing than he was as a politician. Even though under Lincoln he was, it wasn't really a political position, although he did a lot of work for Lincoln, and they called him like the propagandist for Lincoln. He did a lot of the PR stuff, but so much of that afterward, Lincoln was just such a profound impact on him that he kind of steps back for decades,
Mhm.
and it's
Yeah,
interesting to think how that would have changed.
yeah. To put the propagandist and Hayes' role as personal secretary, um, we have to remember that the current way in which we elect presidents in the United States, it was radically different. In the 1800s, presidents did not campaign for themselves.
Mhm.
They did not go to huge mega rallies. They did not buy uh, they did not directly purchase media. Instead, that was very much a function of their proxies. So there's I can remember an incident during the Grant presidency when he went to Alexandria Bay, New York, and he was there to he was kind of there to rally the troops, but it was largely he was going to go rub elbows with all of the people who were putting money and time into his campaign. So it was kind of a thank you, and he wanted to go fishing. So that is more typical of an 18 of the excuse me late 19th century
Yeah,
presidential run.
it was
So
considered untoward
having
to campaign.
mm, yes, having competent people who were able to get the message to the proxies was obviously very important.
Mhm.
So he does play a role. Now, again, does he get Lincoln elected? I think you could probably say no, but he certainly is a contributing voice to that
That
entire
is.
process.
Well,
Um,
and he
yeah,
certainly is
yeah.
for the Lincoln presidency. I mean, he and Nikolai make it a successful presidency.
Yeah,
And if you have
Mhm.
a poor secretary, maybe you're not so successful. So I mean, it's hard to say how much of the success of the Lincoln presidency came because of. Certainly, our perspective of the success of the Lincoln presidency
yeah.
today is largely because of John Hay and I'm sorry, Nikolai, and their
John Nicolay,
and
yeah.
that's an interesting question too. If it's not for them, then Lincoln is maybe not the towering figure
Yeah.
in politics
They
that we think of him today. Maybe he's not on Mount Rushmore.
yeah, they were
And
essentially,
how different is the world if we or how different is the United States if we're
yeah,
not using the role model of the Lincoln that we imagine in our mind, which is the one that they presented. because there were others that were looking to define him differently.
Yeah, I think that there's, and if you want a good example of that, go to modern revisionist historians who basically, again, I refer to it as historical self-flagellation. We want to feel bad about this, who point out that, Lincoln did not directly free the slaves, that he, in private conversations, he perhaps was not the liberal emancipator that was presented, that somehow he was a shady character who just happened to. I don't think A, I don't think it's the case. And B, I think the fact that you have his personal secretaries who are able to pull together information, they are the direct witnesses to it. They lend credibility to the fact that Lincoln was, in fact, a great president and was not some sort of an opportunist who was just able
other
to.
people define his legacy in the 19th century. So the history of Lincoln really comes from how we remember his history, no matter what he did while he was president. If other people define his legacy in the 19th century, I think we have a different nation, because I think we do tend to. If you ask, who are the greatest presidents in history, Lincoln is almost always to the top of that list. But there are certainly people who hate Lincoln. I'm certainly posterior. I mean, we're going to have someone who say that he suspended habeas corpus and that he was a tyrant. But what if that was the perspective that came out of it? And then how does that change how we perceive the world, how we perceive the relationship between people and the government? That actually, I don't think it's insignificant. I think that Lincoln is such a towering figure in U.S. history, and they so define how he's a towering figure in U.S. history, that how we perceive ourselves as a nation would be different if it weren't for their biography. I think that alone would be a reason to remember John Hay, is just because he's the reason that we remember Lincoln the way that we remember Lincoln.
Just to extend that, there were foreign revolutionary movements who appealed to the image of Abraham Lincoln, and many, there were revolutions as well as intellectual movements who were based around the fact that Lincoln was the great emancipator, and here's a man who is saying that, that we in this particular small country in a far corner of the world are worth as much as our colonial overmasters.
Mm-hmm.
So Lincoln is not just a hero to the United States. He's definitely
other nations as well. That's because of that. Those volumes that they wrote to say this is how we're going to remember Abraham Lincoln. So sometimes the person who makes the hero is almost as important as the hero. And the biographer can have an enormous impact on how that person's legacy impacts history, and certainly this is a case there. And even if you do draw back, that it's possible that some of the successes of Lincoln came about because John Hay's secretarial work. But I mean, certainly possible that we might essentially think of Lincoln as a poor president that we don't really pay much attention to, and that's different. And it puts you in because with Hay, one of the problems is in trying to figure out all of his impacts is that he plays so many roles that it's very hard to kind of sit back and say, well, if it wasn't him, then who? And how different would it be with them?
Feels like it would have been multiple people at minimum, right?
So if we're not lionizing Lincoln the way that we do, who do we look to, and what do they mean as a role model? And that's
George
McClellan.
McClellan.
An interesting question.
It's obviously George McClellan.
McClellan, yeah. That's
gosh, even the radical Republicans, had a different vision. For them, I mean, the reason they almost ran against him in '64 is because he wasn't going far enough. There are versions of Lincoln out there that are very, very different,
mm-hmm.
and many of them not more positive. And then possibly we have the most positive view that you can get out of it
because of them, yeah. Which also leaves it open to, I mean, it's not necessarily revisionism because it's not new history, but it also leaves us, to wonder, was Lincoln what we all thought Lincoln to be? And that's an interesting question. But I mean, what we think him to be impacts who we are. And certainly John Hay had a lot to do with what we think him to be. This one, I mean, this is a really fascinating episode because he impacted so much. It is a little bit hard to get your kind of arms around it because there's so many different pieces of policy that they did, and then there's so many different directions that could go. But if you get that to, what if the U.S. is just different? What if we are not the nation that will participate in the wars, or not the nation that is vying for control of the Pacific? Then that leaves so many open spaces for someone to fill that vacuum, because we have been a very powerful state really since the 20th century, and we're a powerful state in the 20th century largely because of what John Hay did. Then the other thing you have to ask, no matter how much we self-flagellate, as Brad's been saying, no matter how much you want to talk about whatever the mistakes that the United States made in that period, whether you see those as mistakes or not, certainly. Who else does it is an interesting question. And is it a better place, the world a better place, or is it not a better place? I mean, in a very simple way, it's hard to say that if the U.S. had simply remained more isolationist, which is what Hay really moved us away from, if we chose not to participate in the world wars and everything else is equal, then there's a good chance, that the Central Powers win the First World War. And maybe that avoids the Second World War. Maybe everybody's a happier place, or maybe, they're the bad guys. Are we the baddies? And so at very least, we can say with a lot of confidence, Hay moved the U.S. in a direction that altered events all over the world stage, that would dramatically change how we are as a nation, but also would dramatically change how everything worked in the world since maybe 1900. And that's something where millions and millions of people are involved.
Yep, it is a fitting footnote that he gets an episode of the podcast.
It is, yes,
because he definitely, he
deserves
he's a major player.
Remembered.
But as you said though, I mean, it's hard to say, oh yeah, he was the guy who did this. Not so much. I would say that perhaps his signature accomplishment, the Panama Canal.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that yes,
alters the world all by itself.
Yes, that
but
is.
I mean, the special relationship and rapprochement also is I mean, that alters the world by itself.
Now back to Greater Sasquatchia, which, as we all know, is in the forest of northern Canada, and their very way of life was threatened by the gold rush. And who would Greater Sasquatchia have sided with in the British-U.S. shooting war, or excuse me, the Canadian-U.S. shooting war
before John Hay negotiates a peace that redraws that border. Yeah, that was the only place I thought maybe bringing him in, is that if not for John Hay, the Yukon Gold Rush becomes a war, which disturbs Sasquatch.
Which could be good or bad for Sasquatch and Greater Sasquatch. It's kind of hard to say. It's a fair point. That's true.
Yeah, but this is the only reason that Hay never received a Nobel Peace Prize, because he was not given the opportunity to negotiate the ultimate peace between Greater Sasquatchia and their Canadian allies versus the United States.
I'm not convinced that Canada and the Sasquatch would be allies. They feel like they're natural rivals for that territory there. Maybe the Sasquatch is band together with the UK or Russia. It's the Sasquatch-Russia axis there in order to oppose the Canadian-British. I don't know. It's an all. I guess
do you think
about Sasquatch, we don't really know much about what if the Sasquatch had their version of John Hay, a skilled and experienced diplomat. Then Sasquatchia might be a much more powerful. Well, I guess we've gone as far as we can on the Sasquatch, but I don't know.
Well, I'm pretty sure the Sasquatch actually probably would have preferred to turn the times back to the Russian occupation, when there were just a few thousand fur traders and prospectors. Absolutely, and things were
Sasquatch ruled.
Things are so much less hectic. It was a much slower world without the complexities of modernism.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow The History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.